Hello. If you've been following this channel recently, you'll have seen that I put out a short series of videos discussing non-duality in a rather uncompromising way. And following this, I received a couple of messages from you guys about the relation between these videos and what is referred to as radical non-duality. Now, I wasn't really familiar with this term, but I did recognise the name Tony Parsons, who is the author of the book The Open Secret, which seems to be the primary source for the current use of the term radical non-duality. So I looked into it and found that it's a rather interesting line of rhetoric that does at times sound similar to some of the things that I have expressed. However, as I listened to more of how non-duality is presented in this radical mode, it also became clear that there is a major difference. While I've been trying to point towards what I've termed self-intelligible immediacy, they're not trying to point toward anything at all. So I thought I might try to articulate what exactly seems off to me with radical non-duality, because on the surface it seems quite difficult to argue against. If you try to argue with it, you fall into the trap that the message transcends. It's not my intention to make this into a takedown or anything like that, because I think the radical non-duality people are doing something that would be helpful for many people, and I've enjoyed listening to the message and the style of rhetoric. To do this, first it will be helpful to explain what radical non-duality is actually saying. In my research on this topic, I came across another guy called Jim Newman, who has a very enjoyable and direct way of communicating, and Jim has several essays on his website, which I have read, and I'm going to share 3 sections from these essays which convey the aspects of the message that will be particularly relevant to my critique. And I should say, the line of reasoning I've shared in previous videos about how there's nothing we can or need to do in regard to the possibility of awakening is also something that the radical non-duality people talk about, so that's not the thing I have a problem with, and it's not something I'm going to highlight here, even though it's a central part of their message. Anyway, we begin. The meeting has a very simple message, that experience is an illusion. I'm talking about the experience of a contracted energy in the body that knows where and what this is, knows what's happening. The suggestion is that's illusory. Illusory in the sense that it's not happening. This is not knowable or real. The experience of knowable or real is illusory. This appearance is never knowable or real. It's never solid. It's never part of a story that's attached to an individual. That is illusory. The appearance is not an illusion. It's the absolute appearing. The only absolutely illusory bit, the only bit that's truly not happening, is that this is real and knowable and happening to me. There's no way to find what this is or what the suggestion is because there's no way to separate from it. It's impossible to find because it's impossible to lose. There is no separation. The experience that there's a sense of loss or something missing or something wrong arises because this appears as something it's not. That experience says, I need to, through my free will and choice, find the meaning and purpose to this apparent happening, this appearance. That's an illusion. There is no meaning and purpose. There's nothing missing. This doesn't need to be completed. It doesn't need to become whole. It already is, and that includes the experience that it isn't. And the second extract, there isn't a person, but that is also just nothing appearing as a person or appearing as no person. Nothing makes a difference. It just doesn't matter because it is not happening. It is not real. The bottom drops out when there is no one left feeling like there is a bottom, because nobody sees nothing. It is the end of looking, and it is not a recognition. There are all these insights or realizations that there is nothing left inside, that there is no such thing as an individual, that everything and nothing are the same thing, that everything is empty and there is no story. Those still seem to me like something happened, and it is still an experienced happening. They are like peepholes into another reality, but they are still peepholes. When all of that ends and there is nothing, that is just something completely else, because when it is recognized that there is no me, that is like something you can talk about, that is like something you can recognize. that there is no one and never was one. But when the bottom drops out, then there is nothing. It is not like there is nothing left, it is like there never was anything. So, there is nothing happening is not a recognition, not a realization, because there is no one to have it. And thirdly, and this one is about the message of radical non-duality in general, I am not giving any advice. There is no point to get. There is nothing to take away from this. This has nothing to do with the experience that this is about something. There is no relationship. This is the end of insights, the end of this being about something. That is the bottom falling out, that this being about something, and all that is left is freefall. And when nothing can be done with it, it is a completely useless message. Completely useless. Fascinating stuff indeed. While I personally find this message to be quite hilarious, and I mean that as a compliment, I do have a major problem with it. And basically, it boils down to this. This appearance is undeniably, spontaneously, self-present and intelligible and meaningful. The very fact that anything appears is already its own self-revealing clarity. That is what awareness and experience really are. In what follows, I shall do my best to articulate why this critique is valid and important to avoid mistaking non-duality for nihilism. I hope you enjoy and find this helpful. So most of this critique is going to focus on the intelligibility of appearance, but I think I should first briefly comment on the practical logic of radical non-duality and the role that spirituality actually plays in human life in general. The first thing to consider is whether there is really much of a difference between the affirmation or rejection of spiritual realization and the affirmation or rejection of something basic like seeing or hearing. That is, does so-called spiritual attainment operate on a deeper level than ordinary experience? Because when we deny that there is anything to attain, or anyone to attain it, it seems we are already taking for granted that spiritual attainment refers to something more ultimate than a conventional experience. Of course, we also understand this assumption to be the nature of delusion itself. There is nothing beyond appearance to reach, and there is no real entity that could reach it. But within this appearance, a mind can either have that understanding, or it could not have it. Just like a window could be clean, or it could be covered in dirt. And since this appearance is changing moment to moment, there can obviously be an apparent transition from obscuration to clarity. The appearance is not moving closer to some abstract truth because there's nothing separate from it, but still it can appear in various modes of self-reflection on the nature of itself. And within this appearance, there appear to be reasons for why one should want to reach a state of clarity, and indeed why one should want to hold meetings that might help others to reach a state of clarity, or perhaps even why one might want to write a book on non-duality. All of that appears, regardless of the fact that there is no actual doer behind it, and regardless of the fact that this clarity is actually just an appearance, just like obscuration and confusion. Obviously, there is a recognition that clarity is desirable, even though both the clarity and the recognition of its value are just appearances. If this were not true, then it would be equally untrue that charity is preferable to murder, which is clearly an abhorrent idea from the perspective of an apparent individual. So, the point I want to make here is that if there is no separate entity or state to realize or to be realized, then any realization and clarity is simply the appearance of an appearance discovering itself as appearance. That is to say, spirituality, which is often characterized as a kind of path, always belongs to the domain of appearance. Realization is just a kind of clarity appearing. It's not some kind of transcendent ultimate achievement, because that idea is confusion appearing, which implies a self and separation and so on. So, when a teacher tells us that realization is not a real achievement because the idea of a real achievement is confusion, they are talking at the level of that confusion. They are at least granting that there is this idea of realization being a real achievement, even though they acknowledge it in order to deny it. Which is a real pain in the arse if you're a teacher, because it would seemingly be easier to get rid of that idea from your mind entirely once you've seen through it, and not have to continue spending time thinking about how this appearance is not really real. And so why would they continue to entertain this idea? Well, for the same reason any spiritual teacher continues to talk about the illusion that they have seen through, because seekers still believe it. So clearly, a teacher of radical non-duality has recognized a problem. There is the appearance of an apparent teacher apparently recognizing an apparent problem, and they engage in communication that is designed to correct that problem. And yet, they insist that they have nothing to teach. Sure, the whole show is just what appears, but since we're already entertaining the idea that people appear confused, why should we shift gears when it comes to the fact that a teacher appears to solve people's confusion? Are we speaking conventionally here? Or are we speaking from an ultimate perspective that we already know doesn't exist? If we can speak conventionally about how we are confused, then we can speak conventionally about not being confused. That seems like a teaching to me, regardless of whether the confused and the clear are no closer or further from reality than each other. Because there is no ultimate outside perspective, and all meaning and value and accuracy and spirituality itself is always apparent and never fundamentally real. I'll return to all this from a more philosophical point of view in a moment, but I just wanted to summarize the relativity of spirituality from a more practical perspective, because remember, radical non-duality exists in the same space and attracts the same kinds of people as any other tradition of non-duality. If radical non-duality were to completely refuse to engage with the purely relative, conventional nature of spiritual communication, then they would have nothing to share in a much stronger sense than they already admit. Like, there would be no impetus for anyone to ever show up to their meetings at all, which would mean that nobody actually ever would show up. But since people do show up, there is an impetus for them to show up, and there is something there to be learned. It's a bit like running a webinar on how not to get scammed, and the webinar is itself a scam. But is it really a scam? By getting scammed, you learn how not to get scammed again, and so you weren't actually scammed at all. Anyway, let's get on with the proper critique. So, I think the most obvious criticism one could make of radical non-duality is that it sounds a lot like nihilism, the belief that nothing has value or meaning. Of course, radical non-duality teachers are not saying that nothing exists in an absolute sense. When they say nothing is happening, they mean that the apparent activity of life is not happening for anyone and is not being done by anyone. This sense of activity, including the act of a teacher speaking about non-duality, only seems to exist as something intentful or meaningful, insofar as there appears to be someone to whom it matters. When that someone is no longer felt to exist as a separate being, there is simply what appears, without any internal reference point. However, in emphasizing that there is no personal agency, or purpose, or recognition, the teaching can sound as if the appearing of life has no intrinsic sense of knowing at all, as if reality is a kind of unconscious or unrecognized display. But even without the constant reference to a separate self, experience still has a clear, immediate quality to it. Even without a real separate observer watching experience, experience is self-revealing. When this self-revelation of what is filtered through a sense of separateness, contraction and confusion appear, because experience is then measured against fear, desire, and control. But when it is not obstructed in this way, calmness, compassion, and wisdom appear. The absence of a personal owner of knowing does not mean the absence of distinct expressions of it. These expressions, which we usually misinterpret as separate beings, still happen spontaneously, and they can still appear distorted by contraction or not. Teachers of radical non-duality are extremely careful not to suggest the existence of any reference point at all. No center, no observer, no awareness that stands apart from what is. and they know that the moment they speak this message, it falls apart, because anything spoken is an idea that the mind can understand. So, they say, it is not a teaching, and not a message, and that you cannot understand what they are actually communicating because there is no one to understand. They want to express the least they can possibly express without expressing nothing at all, and so the only thing they can express is the deconstruction of the very thing they are expressing. In this way, they can justify the assertion that they are not really expressing anything, even though all of this is, in practice, quite understandable to the sense of a separate self. This approach serves a very important purpose, but when it's universalized as a message, with no flexibility, when every mention of clarity, knowing, or presence is dismissed as dualistic, it runs the risk of erasing the very clarity and knowing and presence that the teaching, I assume, is actually pointing toward in its own subtle way. For radical non-duality, all activity is simply what seems to be, and it doesn't belong to anything or anyone. There is no state that comes after the end of self-belief, because there never really was a self to believe in itself to begin with. There only seemed to be. But to say that there never was a self who could refer to itself already assumes a kind of vantage point, a capacity to notice the difference between the sense of being a self and the recognition that there isn't one. Even the act of saying there is no self-reference or self-belief depends on some kind of discernment of what that means. To make the distinction at all, to acknowledge that there is a difference between the seemingness of illusion and the seemingness of its absence, is already to participate in the appearance of understanding. One cannot coherently assert that nothing is actually happening, while also recognizing that there has been a shift from the experience of self-belief to its disappearance. Not because something real has changed, but because the recognition of the unreality of the self is itself something that appears. It doesn't really matter if the change reveals the unreality of the thing that seemed to change, the recognition of that unreality still shows up. To say that this recognition only seems to happen from the perspective of that which it seemed to happen to is to dismiss the meaningfulness of what appears, as if what appears has no intelligibility or value or sense at all. The very fact that this apparent shift can be spoken of and understood shows that meaning is present regardless of whether the sense of self grasps it as meaningful or not. Meaning is not something added to appearances by a separate subject. It is how appearances naturally show themselves as knowable. To deny that self-revealing quality is to deny the very condition that makes the denial of self possible. Meaning and intelligibility are not separate from what is. They are expressions of the same self-revealing presence that radical non-duality both points towards and tries to negate. Nevertheless, they make a very valid point that there can be no after-the-fact understanding that there never was a self, because it is only from the perspective of being a separate self that such an understanding would be relevant. The sense of self is nothing but self-assertion, which cannot reject itself by definition. The state of selflessness cannot be something attained by the sense of self. At most, there can be a dissolution of the intellectual assertion that there is anything separate to collapse, and a recognition that there is not ultimately any true shift or awakening, only different degrees of contraction. But still, the story we tell of awakening is apparent, and it functions regardless of whether there is a real person behind it or not. It is the functional meaningfulness of this story that allows us to speak practically about wisdom and confusion, and about the kinds of activity that naturally follow from the appearance of each. It remains true that when action occurs without a sense of personal ownership, what really does exist is expressed clearly through that aperture which doesn't. The intelligibility of life that allows things to make sense, and the way life unfolds naturally, are not separate. If our communications about spirituality were only a meaningless story with no inherent sense, they would lose the coherence that allows them to be recognized as a story at all. To say that something only seems to be, rather than simply is, already assumes an intelligibility that allows that distinction to be made. And even if someone claims that meaning and intelligibility only seem to exist, that claim is itself meaningful and intelligible. The radical non-dualist says that they cannot really have a message, because the message they apparently do have depends on the intelligibility it denies. But to say that anything appears, even as a mere seeming, is already to acknowledge that there is an understandable space in which that appearance takes place. It is to admit the self-revealing nature of appearance itself, and the way things show up as knowable. As I've explained in previous videos, one cannot coherently deny the conditions that make denial itself possible. Knowing is not something done by a knower. It is just the event of appearance revealing itself. Meaning is spontaneous, self-arising, and without an owner or cause. Appearance is intelligible to itself, precisely because appearing and knowing are the same event. If one denies the recognition of intelligibility altogether, then there is simply nothing to discuss. To say that all claims, teachings, and seemings are merely what appears, without any meaning at all, is to translate silence into sound for no point whatsoever. And in that case, why bother speaking? Why not just be silent? Well, of course, for no reason. That's just what seems to happen by itself. But if there were truly no difference between coherent expression and mere noise, then communication could never be recognized as communication at all. It would become indistinguishable from nonsense or from silence. But the radical non-dualist is not silent. They actively speak to deny that there is anyone who has realized anything, and in doing so, they convey to us their reflexivity. In claiming that there is no recognition, they recognize its absence. You cannot escape the illusion that there is an escape from reflexivity, for even the recognition that there is nothing to escape is permeated by it. Hence, the radical non-dualist has realized nothing and has no message. And yet, the impossibility of taking a final position is itself the freedom from positions. You can call this state nothing if you prefer, but you have not reached a more authentic stance than if you were to call it self-aware openness. Because that's what this is, right? It is often confused and troubled, and it misunderstands itself, but it is certainly self-aware in the sense that it is present to itself. If what is were not revealed to itself at all, it would not be this. It would be something else. But there is nothing else, and this is present to itself. To negate everything until nothing remains, out of fear that otherwise we might imply a subtle trace of selfhood, is a choice of style, and it is a style that risks overextending itself and obscuring even the vitality of this ineffable openness. The attempt to dissolve all reference points still directs attention towards the collapse of reference points. People listen, words are understood, and meaning is apparently exchanged between minds that apparently exist. One can call it not a teaching, yet people still gather to hear it, and non-teachers still appear to speak it. In practice, this pointing enacts the very self-awareness it claims to deny. You can say that the apparent meaningfulness of the message points to nothing deeper, but that's because there is nothing deeper. There is no higher view. You cannot transcend reflexivity. So why deny it? Why not play with it instead and recognize the apparent meaningfulness of what appears? Self-awareness is the inseparability of appearance and its intelligibility, not the awareness of a subject, but immediate knowability. And it is everything. That is what appearance is, what this is. There is no knower and nothing known, but there is knowing. Thus, in the end, the radical non-dualist message does not erase awareness, it performs it. It is a performance that reveals, through its very self-negation, the luminous openness of what is.